In the heart of Wyoming, secrets run deeper than the Platte River. Eleanor Vance had money, a powerful husband, and a life stitched into the very fabric of tradition. But she had no fire. Not until a ranch hand, a man of earth and shadow, walked out of the stables and into her life. Clay Walker smelled of leather, sweat, and a kind of danger that scared and thrilled her all at once. She knew this was a mistake, a reckless, unforgivable mistake. But a woman starving for air doesn't stop to ask permission. She just breathes. You look at Eleanor Vance and you think you know her story. The gorgeous, well-dressed wife on a sprawling Wyoming ranch, the trophy wife living the perfect life. But sometimes, the most beautiful pictures hide the deepest cracks. If you're out there, maybe married for years, maybe just going through the motions, you know the feeling. That chill in the air, that quiet that settles in the house, a quiet so loud it swallows your soul. It's the sound of a love that didn't die in a fiery fight. It just slowly, politely froze over. That was Ellie's reality at the Ironwood Ranch. She had the wealth, the security, and the respectable husband, Mitch Hayes. She had a life meticulously stitched into the fabric of tradition, but she had lost her fire. She was safe, yes, absolutely safe, but safety had turned into a gilded cage, a beautiful prison where every day felt exactly the same. Ellie wasn't living a fairy tale. She was living a rehearsal for the rest of her life, and the script was already finished. And that's when the script got thrown out the window, because in the heart of Wyoming, secrets run deeper than the Platte River. Not until a ranch hand, a man of earth and shadow, walked out of the stables and into her life. Clay Walker smelled of leather, sweat, and a kind of danger that scared and thrilled her all at once. He was the vital, untamed protest against her quiet existence. She knew this was a mistake, a reckless, unforgivable mistake. Clay was trouble, wrapped in denim and grit, everything her respectable world warned her against. But a woman starving for air doesn't stop to ask permission. She just breathes. And Ellie was desperate to breathe again. So stay with us, because this isn't just a story about a forbidden romance. It's about what happens when a woman chooses to break free, regardless of the cost. If you've ever wondered what might lie just beyond the fence line of your own life, you need to hear this. Don't go anywhere, and make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this is the story that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about love, marriage, and survival. The dust of 1,000 acres settled differently on Eleanor Vance. It was the dust of old money, old promises, and an even older emptiness. She sat, as she did every afternoon, on the faded antique armchair on the wraparound porch, its wicker groaning a familiar, comforting sound that matched the quiet complaint of her heart. From this perch, she could see the vast, indifferent landscape of Wyoming, a perfect reflection of the vast, indifferent landscape of her marriage to Mitch Hayes. Mitch Hayes was a good provider, a respectable man, and a cold companion. Their life was a meticulously managed ledger. Dinners at 6, charity galas in Jackson Hole, and polite, distant silences in the colossal master bedroom. The Ironwood Ranch was their masterpiece, a monument to their success, but it was also her prison. The silence was the worst part, a deep, pervasive quiet where even the gentle song of the sparrows sounded like a mournful echo, a reminder that no joyful sound lived within her walls. It was the sound of a love that didn't die in a fiery fight. It just slowly, politely froze over. Eleanor watched him without blinking, a guilty fascination tightening the knot in her stomach. He was sweat-damped and smelled, even from this distance, of honest labor and sun-baked leather. For the first time in years, the vast horizon seemed to shrink. Her focus narrowed to this one dangerous point of light. The sheer physicality of the man was a stark contrast to the manicured, emotionally sterile life she led. It was intoxicating. The stable door slammed shut, breaking the spell, and Clay glanced up, his eyes, dark and piercing, meeting hers across the yard. The unexpected directness of his look sent a jolt, not of fear, but of electric recognition. He didn't bow his head or look away first. He simply held her gaze for one beat too long, acknowledging her presence, acknowledging her. It felt like an invitation to a secret she hadn't known she was keeping. Eleanor lifted her chin, the icy composure of Mrs. Mitchell Hayes snapping back into place, forcing a polite, distant nod. But the internal landscape had shifted. The ice was melting. She knew then that she had invited a predator into her quiet little world, one that didn't just threaten her marriage, but her entire identity. This ranch was about to become very, very small. But she didn't know his arrival wasn't a coincidence, but the first move in a much bigger plan.
Mitch Hayes returned 2 days later from Denver, smelling faintly of airport lounge coffee and expensive, unfulfilled ambition. He barely noticed Eleanor sitting on the porch, too busy on his phone finalizing a land deal that had been troubling him for weeks. He pecked her cheek, a gesture purely for show, devoid of any actual warmth, and headed straight inside, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. Their brief transactional interaction only intensified the chilling sense of aloneness that was Ellie's constant companion at the Ironwood Ranch. Later that evening, the tension of the quiet crisis became almost unbearable. Mitch paced the study, muttering about deadlines and hostile takeovers. Eleanor watched him from the doorway, realizing that his distress wasn't about the ranch itself, but about the cost of the ranch. She knew Mitch was stretched thin, having liquidated assets to acquire this land, but he refused to discuss the specifics. This financial opacity was just another element of their marriage that had long since suffocated any intimacy they once shared. The next morning, the silence was literally broken by the roar of machinery and the rhythmic thud of a hammer. Out in the midday sun, Clay was working on the far fence line, shirtless, his back a map of hard-defined muscle that drew Eleanor's gaze like a magnet. His presence was not just a distraction, it was a loud, vibrant protest against the suffocating silence of her home. The sun caught the dust rising around him, creating a golden halo that made him seem mythical, dangerous. Eleanor found herself walking toward the stables, a completely manufactured excuse about needing a horse ready for a non-existent ride. As she approached, the air changed. The pristine cleanliness of her house was replaced by the honest, pungent smell of hay, rich earth, and a faint smoky cedar. Clay stopped hammering, wiping his brow with the back of his hand as he finally turned to her. His eyes were the color of deep river water, completely unguarded and assessing. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice rough, low, and perfectly relaxed, a stark contrast to Mitch's nervous, high-pitched urgency. "Just finishing up here, that old fence post was ready to fall over." His gaze made the air thick and heavy, and Ellie felt a flush creeping up her neck, a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was a teenager. The polite distance was impossible. He was too real, too close. She stammered out her request about the horse, her heart pounding a frantic drum against her ribs. When he leaned in slightly to confirm the details, the proximity was devastating. He was an intoxicating mix of peril and salvation, and she knew she was drowning in the simple, fundamental truth of him. She was seeking refuge in a fire, and she didn't even try to pull back. But the truth was, Clay wasn't there to fix fences. He was there to tear down everything Mitch had built. The electric moment by the tack shed had solidified Clay's position in Ellie's mind. He was a forbidden distraction, a challenge she should avoid at all costs. Yet the ranch was small enough and their orbits close enough that avoidance proved impossible. She found herself subconsciously slowing down near the stables, lingering in the garden, and taking a perverse pleasure in the quickening of her pulse whenever she heard his distinct low whistle carried on the wind. The familiar routine of her life was disintegrating, replaced by the thrilling chaos of anticipation. She often watched Mitch on his calls, noting the increasing tension in his jaw and the clipped professional tone he used when discussing assets and leverage. Their marriage had morphed years ago into a business arrangement where their affection was measured by the size of the ranch and the success of his investments. There was a cold security in that, but security, Ellie realized, felt exactly like being caged. The wedding ring on her finger felt less like a symbol of love and more like a heavy golden anchor chaining her to a life that wasn't truly her own. This emptiness was the silent, crucial justification for the dangerous curiosity that drew her to Clay. Her husband offered stability. Clay offered a chance at instability, a flicker of chaos that felt like life itself. Later that afternoon, she found him by the dilapidated tack shed, organizing old saddles. His hands, rough and competent, handled the weathered leather with an almost intimate reverence. The late sun gilded the dust motes around him, making the common shore look like a scene from a forgotten legend. This moment was the internal hook. He straightened up, his eyes meeting hers, and Ellie felt the pull, a magnetic force that was utterly undeniable. He didn't ask her anything polite. He simply observed her, patiently waiting. She realized Mitch never simply waited for her. He always demanded her time or attention, or ignored her entirely. Clay's silence was a bold question. "You should be careful with that old leather, Clay," she managed, her voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. "It's practically an antique." He let a slow, utterly charming smile spread across his lips, the first one she'd seen. "Antiques are usually worth more than the new stuff, Mrs. Hayes. They got a story to tell." Eleanor felt the implication like a physical blow. She was the antique, and he was ready to hear her story. Her composure finally broke, not with a gasp, but with a sudden, furious awareness of her own isolation. She turned to leave, knowing that if she stayed a second longer, she would confess everything about the terrible loneliness that weighed her down like gold. But the confession wouldn't come with words. It would come with a touch she could no longer avoid.
The electric moment by the tack shed had solidified Clay's position in Ellie's mind. He was a forbidden distraction, a challenge she should avoid at all costs. Yet the ranch was small enough, and their orbits close enough, that avoidance proved impossible. She found herself subconsciously slowing down near the stables, lingering in the garden, and taking a perverse pleasure in the quickening of her pulse whenever she heard his distinct, low whistle carried on the wind. The familiar routine of her life was disintegrating, replaced by the thrilling chaos of anticipation. Mitch, oblivious in his financial bubble, spent the evening glued to his laptop, occasionally venting his frustration about a competitor or a delayed wire transfer. He was physically present but completely absent, a ghost in his own expensive house. Eleanor tried to engage him about the ranch, mentioning the fence post Clay had fixed, hoping for a genuine conversation. Mitch merely waved his hand dismissively. "Good, that's what I pay them for," he said, without looking up. This utter lack of emotional connection was the fuel for Ellie's burgeoning defiance. 2 days later, the unavoidable happened. Ellie was riding her horse, Belle, deep in the north pasture when Belle stumbled, throwing a shoe and suddenly going lame. Ellie was miles from the main house, and her cell phone, of course, had no signal in the ravine. A wave of helplessness and sheer panic washed over her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel since she married the powerful Mitch. This moment was the internal hook. Just as her despair peaked, a familiar shape crested the ridge, Clay Walker, riding bareback, his silhouette stark against the pale sky. He rode up without a word, his gaze immediately going to Belle's leg with an intense, practical focus. His competence was terrifyingly attractive. He dismounted, and the proximity was immediate. Unavoidable. She threw a shoe. Looks like she twisted that fetlock a little, Clay stated, his voice calm, cutting through her panic. He moved with swift certainty, his large, calloused hand gently tracing the contours of Belle's leg. As he worked, his knuckles brushed Ellie's own hand, which was resting near the saddle horn. That accidental contact, brief and unintentional, was the most profound communication she'd had in years. It was real. The scent of his skin, warm from the sun and mixed with the musk of horse and leather, filled her senses, chasing away the faint, stale scent of her husband's office. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the sudden, powerful knowledge that this man could offer her something her whole life of luxury could not. The sheer, raw, unfiltered feeling of being attended to. She stared at his hands, realizing they were capable of both healing and, quite possibly, immense destruction. But she didn't realize that by letting him touch her horse, she had given him permission to touch her life. Clay rigged a makeshift sling for Belle and started the slow walk back to the stables, leading the horse and Ellie, who walked silently beside him. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating long dancing shadows that felt both intimate and secretive. The simple shared necessity of the moment, caring for the injured animal, formed a connection more profound than any dinner party conversation Ellie had endured with Mitch. She noticed the small scar above Clay's left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that made his rugged handsomeness more real. The silence that settled between them was heavy, yet unlike the empty silence of her home, this one was charged with unspoken electricity and dangerous understanding. Every rhythmic step of the horses, every crunch of gravel beneath their boots only emphasized their proximity. She felt the warmth radiating off his shoulder, and the sheer urge to reach out and confirm that he was in fact real was almost overwhelming. It was a terrifying, wonderful recognition that someone saw her, not as Mrs. Hayes, but as Eleanor. They finally reached the stables, the air immediately cooler and darker inside. Clay quickly tended to Belle, his movements economical and strong. Ellie watched, leaning against a rough wooden post, her gaze fixed on the powerful muscles of his back as he worked. This was her internal hook. She realized the true danger wasn't just physical attraction, it was the intoxicating feeling of witnessing genuine, unfiltered competence and passion directed at a simple, honest task. "She'll be fine," Clay said, finally turning to face her, his eyes serious. "Just needs rest. You shouldn't ride out that far alone, Mrs. Hayes. Anything can happen." The gentle scolding in his tone wasn't patronizing. It was a genuine note of care, something Eleanor hadn't heard from Mitch in years. Mitch offered insurance, Clay offered protection, and the difference felt monumental. Eleanor stepped away from the post, her composure faltering. "I guess I don't feel much like resting lately, Clay," she confessed, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her voice was barely a whisper. The air seemed to hold its breath, thick with the weight of her unsaid words, the loneliness, the despair, the aching need for connection. He took a slow step closer, his gaze locked on hers. He didn't offer comfort or pity, just the hard, honest truth of his presence. "Life on the ranch is simple, ma'am, but it's never still," he murmured, a promise and a warning rolled into one. In that moment, Eleanor knew her carefully constructed life was balancing on a single dangerous breath, and she knew she was about to exhale.
Clay's hand remained on Eleanor's cheek, his calloused thumb resting right where her composure had finally broken. The air in the hayloft was suddenly too thin, too hot, saturated with the earthy scent of the ranch and the musk of his proximity. She didn't have to look at him to know his dark eyes were burning into hers. She felt it in the furious beat of her own heart. This was the moment of decision, a clear fork in the road between the gilded cage and the reckless unknown. Her civilized training screamed at her to step back, to offer a polite, distant apology and retreat to her safe, cold house. But the woman starving for air, the woman Mitch had neglected for so long, refused to listen. She inhaled sharply, drawing in the scent of him, and made the single fatal mistake of leaning forward, closing the last impossible inch of space between them. She was choosing vitality over virtue, life over duty. The kiss wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was a desperate, immediate claiming, a collision of two people starved for connection. Clay's lips were firm, tasting of the dusty outdoor air and a faint hint of peppermint, a brutal, beautiful reality check. He used his other arm to steady her, pulling her close against the solid, unyielding heap of his body. The world tilted and vanished, leaving only the frantic drum of her blood and the rough texture of his shirt against her skin. This moment was the internal hook. Ellie clung to him, pouring years of loneliness and polite resentment into the touch. This kiss was her confession, her rebellion, and her first truly selfish act in a decade. She realized with chilling clarity that this brief, searing moment of passion was worth every lie and every consequence that would follow. It was the deepest, most dangerous breath she had ever taken. When Clay finally pulled back, he didn't move far, keeping his forehead pressed lightly against hers, both of them breathing hard, raggedly. His eyes, now dark with shared guilt and desire, searched hers for regret. Eleanor didn't find shame. She found a profound, terrifying sense of belonging, a feeling that contradicted everything her diamond ring stood for. The price of that breath, she knew, would be immense. She finally pushed gently away, her legs weak, her mind already racing ahead to the impossible logistics of covering up her crime. The sweet, illicit taste of him lingered on her lips, an undeniable stain on her trophy wife perfection. She walked out of the hayloft, leaving behind the woman she had been. But the betrayal was only just beginning to root. And little did she know that the first secret kiss was the moment the real game truly began. A game Mitch was already playing. Eleanor returned to the main house in a fog of exhilaration and bone-deep terror. The sweet, illicit taste of Clay's kiss still burned on her lips, a stain she felt she couldn't wash away no matter how many times she wiped her mouth. The guilt was immediate and crushing, but beneath it, a dangerous, thrilling satisfaction stubbornly persisted. She spent the evening navigating the empty silence of the house, every squeak of the floorboards or shadow on the wall making her jump, convinced that Mitch knew. The expensive antique clock in the hallway chimed with unnerving regularity, each sound mocking her impulsive, reckless act. This overwhelming sense of being watched, of being exposed, was far worse than the loneliness she had tried to escape. Later, she found herself standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the distant dark silhouette of the stables. The memory of Clay's hands, strong and sure, was a searing contrast to the cold, gold anchor of her wedding ring. This was her internal hook. She realized the kiss hadn't just been about passion. It was a desperate attempt to feel something real in a world made entirely of artifice, a survival instinct kicking in. Mitch finally called from Denver, his tone brusque and hurried. He didn't ask where she had been or how she was. He simply rattled off a list of tasks for her secretary and reminded her to be available for a call with his lawyer later that week. The conversation was a perfect, chilling reminder of the emotional vacuum she lived in, instantly dampening the lingering guilt and reigniting the fire of her defiance. As she hung up, a small detail from the hayloft flashed in her mind. Just before the kiss, Clay had gestured almost imperceptibly towards Mitch's office window, a quick, subtle movement Ellie had dismissed at the time. Now, combined with his earlier comment about being trapped by something you bought into, the gesture felt intentional, a chilling suggestion that Clay had been watching Mitch all along. A new cold wave of fear washed over her, replacing the heat of desire. Clay was not just a forbidden lover. He was an observer, and possibly something far more calculated. Eleanor suddenly felt less like a rebellious wife and more like a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand. A game that might cost her more than just her marriage. But she couldn't pull back now, because the deeper she went into his orbit, she realized Clay held the key not only to her heart, but to Mitch's biggest secret. The need for proximity to Clay became a physical craving for Eleanor, a desperate hunger that no amount of wealth or social standing could satisfy. Her internal world, once meticulously organized, was now centered entirely around stealing moments with the ranch hand. It was in one of these stolen moments, an exchange of few words while he mended a bridle near the supply shed, that Ellie decided to shift the dynamics of their dangerous connection. She wasn't just seeking passion anymore. She was seeking answers. Mitch's increasing secrecy and the chilling mention of collateral had shaken her foundation more than the infidelity itself. She felt a burning need to understand what financial storm was brewing under her roof, and she suspected Clay's keen eyes and position on the ranch gave him a unique perspective. He saw the coming and going, the hurried phone calls, and the tension that Mitch carefully concealed from his business peers. She walked straight up to him, bypassing the usual polite small talk, and asked the question that had been burning a hole in her conscience. "Mitch told me you worked here before, Clay. A few years back, before we bought the Ironwood." Her tone was carefully casual, but her heart hammered in her chest, betraying the immense risk she was taking. It was a direct probe into the layers of deception surrounding her husband. This moment was the internal hook. Clay stopped working, his gaze lifting slowly to meet hers, his expression guarded and suddenly cold, the same dark intensity that had first unnerved her. "I worked a couple of places in the valley, Mrs. Hayes. This ranch included," he confirmed, his voice flat. His non-answer was an answer in itself, confirming that he was holding back, protecting a secret that was not entirely his own. The silence that followed stretched thin, heavy with the weight of her suspicion and his caution. Ellie pressed him, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Mitch is in trouble, Clay. Real trouble. He's risking the land. Do you know who he's involved with?" She felt the shame of betraying her husband, but the fear of ruin was stronger than her sense of loyalty to an empty marriage. He stepped closer, his body shielding her from the possibility of being seen from the main house. He didn't speak of money, but of connection. "You owe Mitch nothing, Ellie," he murmured, using her informal name for the first time, a bold, intimate claim. He didn't give her the answer she needed, but he gave her the permission she craved, and she realized the second debt she was accumulating was far more dangerous than the first, a debt to a man whose motives were utterly unknown. But as their passionate trysts began, Ellie would soon discover that Clay had a reason for returning to the Ironwood Ranch that had nothing to do with her. The tension that had simmered between Eleanor and Clay for weeks finally boiled over into a series of reckless, passionate encounters. The hayloft became their secret sanctuary, a place where the rules of polite society and the vows of her marriage simply did not apply. Ellie felt a wild, liberating joy in these stolen moments, an intense physical affirmation that she was indeed still capable of feeling. The scent of hay and honest sweat became the intoxicating perfume of freedom and transgression. Mitch's frequent absences, consumed by his mounting financial pressures in Denver, unintentionally facilitated the affair. He was so wrapped up in his own survival that he didn't notice the fire his wife was walking into, or perhaps he simply didn't care enough to look. His indifference was the ultimate betrayal, the silent weapon that gave Ellie the moral or self-justified authority to pursue the forbidden comfort Clay offered. It was during one rain-slicked afternoon, hidden by the downpour in the shadows of the loft, that their connection moved past pure physicality. As they talked about nothing and everything, Ellie noticed a faint, faded scar on Clay's inner forearm, a small, pale circle that looked old and oddly familiar. This was her internal hook. A tiny piece of the man she desired, hinting at a history she didn't know. "What happened here?" she asked softly, tracing the scar with a hesitant fingertip. Clay flinched slightly, withdrawing his arm, the quick movement betraying a flicker of guard and deep pain. He hesitated, and the air immediately thickened with a different kind of secret, one that had nothing to do with Mitch's finances, but everything to do with Clay's past. "Just an old ranch accident," he finally said, his voice flat, emotionless. But the way he avoided her eyes confirmed it was a lie, a carefully constructed answer. The scar itself didn't reveal much, but the sudden coldness in his demeanor was a revelation. Clay Walker was more complex, and perhaps more dangerous than she had imagined. He wasn't just a simple ranch hand seeking an affair. Eleanor pressed the issue no further, sensing a firm, invisible boundary she shouldn't cross. But the seed of doubt was planted. The scar looked unnervingly like an old brand burn, a mark that belonged to a history far rougher than ranch accidents. She realized the danger in her lover wasn't just that he was forbidden, but that he was fundamentally unknowable.
The suspicion about Clay's scar, coupled with Mitch's panicked phone calls, created a volatile mix of fear and excitement in Eleanor. Her reckless need for Clay intensified, driven now not just by passion, but by a desperate need for proximity to information. She began taking calculated risks, meeting Clay near the main house after dark, lingering just outside the stable doors after feeding time. The thrill of discovery was almost as addictive as the rush of their stolen kisses. One evening, Mitch returned late from a trip, clearly agitated and drinking heavily in his study. Eleanor, feigning sleep, crept downstairs, drawn by the sound of his low, aggressive voice talking on the phone. She pressed her ear against the heavy oak door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the wood, listening for any concrete detail that could confirm her growing fear about their financial situation. The silence from the room was punctuated only by Mitch's frustrated sighs. This was her internal hook. The risk of being caught listening to her husband's private call was immense, but the need to understand the true threat to her home and her future was overwhelming. Mitch spoke sharply. "The land is appraised correctly, Mitch. Just get me the numbers. And tell that idiot Silas Creek I'm not playing his games." The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow, a sudden, cold piece of evidence in the puzzle of Mitch's secrecy. She retreated quietly back upstairs, her mind racing. Silas Creek. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Mitch spoke it, with venom and outright fear, told her everything. It was the name of the predator circling her husband, the source of the financial storm. The gilded cage wasn't built on sand, it was built on a debt owed to a dangerous, unknown entity. She was no longer just dealing with a cold marriage, she was dealing with a criminal threat. The next morning, Eleanor sought Clay out with a new sense of purpose, finding him fixing a broken water pump near the old, unused windmill. She approached him not as a lover, but as a conspirator. "I heard a name last night," she whispered, her eyes urgently scanning the empty horizon. "Silas Creek. Does that name mean anything to you?" Clay stopped working instantly, his wrench dropping with a loud clang on the hard-packed dirt. His body went rigid, his dark eyes instantly locking on hers, suddenly devoid of any softness, replaced by a cold, hard focus she had never seen before. Ellie realized she hadn't just spoken a name, she had triggered a violent memory, and the danger was far closer than the city lights of Jackson Hole. But she couldn't have predicted that the man she was falling for wasn't just working on the ranch, he was working for Silas Creek. The cold, hard focus in Clay's eyes when Ellie mentioned the name Silas Creek was a terrifying shift. The simple ranch hand was gone, replaced by a man coiled with purpose and deep-seated rage. He immediately grabbed Ellie's arm, not in passion, but in urgency, and pulled her roughly behind the broken windmill, out of sight of the main house.
The scent of fear, mixed with his signature musk of earth and leather, was suffocating. "Where did you hear that name?" Clay demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. His grip on her arm was firm, an unexpected display of force that both frightened and thrilled her. Ellie, galvanized by the danger, stood her ground. Mitch said it. He sounded terrified. "What does he have to do with you, Clay? With this ranch?" Her questions tumbled out, urgent and demanding an end to the secrets. Clay looked away, up at the towering, silent blades of the windmill, a gesture of profound resignation. He finally released her arm and pulled up the sleeve of his shirt, revealing the pale, faded scar Ellie had noticed earlier, the one that looked like an old brand burn. This was her internal hook. The scar was the key, the physical embodiment of the dark history she was now entering. "It's not an accident, Ellie," he confessed, his voice heavy with a history she couldn't fathom. "Silas Creek is a ghost I've been running from my whole life. He owns everything that runs through this valley, and I owe him a debt I've been trying to pay off for 10 years. The admission of a debt, not just of money, but of time, and perhaps loyalty, was a chilling parallel to Mitch's own struggles." He turned back to her, his dark eyes vulnerable yet resolute. "I came back to the Ironwood because Mitch Hayes bought it from Creek, and Creek wants it back. He knows Mitch is bleeding out financially, and he's using me as leverage." The shocking implication was clear. Clay was not just a hired hand. He was an involuntary spy or a weapon in the hands of Mitch's creditor. Eleanor stared at the scar, the physical proof of a harsh, brutal past that made her cold, safe life with Mitch seem childish. The kiss, the intimacy, the forbidden passion was all entangled now in a dangerous web of high-stakes finance and forced obedience. She realized her forbidden lover wasn't just a threat to her marriage. He was part of the threat to her entire future. But the truth was darker than she imagined. Silas Creek hadn't just used Clay. He had a familial connection to the very man trying to take down Mitch Hayes.
Eleanor felt a seismic shift in her reality. The choice was no longer between a boring marriage and forbidden passion. It was between two different forms of danger. Clay's confession, the scar, the debt to Silas Creek, the reluctant role as an insider made him terrifyingly real, yet it strangely solidified her connection to him. In this shared secret, this shared danger, she felt a loyalty that Mitch's 10 years of marriage had never earned. She decided, then and there, that she would rather face the storm with Clay than remain alone in Mitch's cold, crumbling safety. "I won't let him take the ranch, Clay," she declared, her voice firm, the new resilience surprising even herself. "Mitch may be reckless, but this is my home now. We need to know what Creek wants." She stepped closer to Clay, the boundary between lover and ally completely dissolving. Their forbidden affair had suddenly morphed into a high-stakes conspiracy, binding them together with a fear far stronger than simple desire. They began meeting covertly, no longer just for passion, but to share information. Ellie, now acutely aware, watched Mitch with a calculating eye. She noted the secure documents he brought home, the coded names in his ledger, and the increasingly desperate tone of his calls. This new role was her internal hook. She was reclaiming her power, turning her role as the passive trophy wife into that of an active operative against the man who had stifled her. During one late-night rendezvous in the hayloft, Clay revealed a chilling piece of the puzzle, information he'd pieced together from his own knowledge of the valley's darker figures. "Silas Creek doesn't just want the money, Ellie," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "The way Mitch has been avoiding him, Creek is Mitch's mother's cousin or something like that. Old, estranged family, the debt runs deep, generational." The revelation was shocking. The conflict wasn't purely financial. It was a venomous family feud playing out on the Ironwood Ranch. Mitch wasn't just hiding a financial risk from her. He was hiding a deeply personal, familial vendetta. He had chosen to keep her in the dark about a risk that involved his own bloodline, proving the ultimate distance between them. Eleanor felt a profound, cold fury, not just at Mitch's deception, but at the realization that Clay, the man she was betraying him with, was the only person who had told her the whole, ugly truth. She knew that to save her home, she would have to completely destroy her husband, and the thought, terrifyingly, felt less like a tragedy and more like justice. But she couldn't guess that Silas Creek had a much more specific interest in the ranch itself, a secret tied to the Vance family land history, not just Mitch's debt. The Ironwood Ranch suddenly felt like a battlefield, with Eleanor and Clay as reluctant allies operating behind enemy lines. Mitch, increasingly erratic and desperate, had begun locking away documents in his study safe, a move that only intensified Ellie's resolve. The familial aspect of the conflict, Mitch hiding a vendetta tied to his own bloodline, confirmed his isolation and her duty to protect the life she had fought so hard to build, even if it was a flawed one. Her relationship with Clay had become less about pure passion and more about shared survival. Ellie knew that to truly understand the nature of Silas Creek's interest, she needed to see the paperwork. Mitch's office, usually a symbol of his control, was now her target. She waited until the middle of the night, when Mitch was in a drunken, exhausted slumber, before quietly slipping out of their colossal bedroom. The grand, silent hallways of the house, usually terrifying in their emptiness, now offered a cloak of darkness that felt liberating. She crept into the study. The dark wood paneling and the scent of fine cigar smoke instantly reminded her of Mitch's cold dominance. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not with the heat of forbidden desire, but with the cold, hard adrenaline of a spy. This was her internal hook, the moment she realized her quest for love had become a quest for truth, trading her vanity for courage. She knelt before the heavy safe hidden behind a framed landscape. She remembered Mitch muttering the code one evening after too much bourbon, an old date, the year his grandfather founded their first business. With trembling fingers, she entered the numbers. The soft click of the tumblers releasing was the loudest sound she had ever heard, a sound that signaled the beginning of her true freedom or her complete ruin. Inside, among the stock certificates and legal documents, was a thick folder labeled Vance/Creek Land Rights 1948. It was not a document about Mitch's investments, but about the history of the land itself, a history tied to both families. Just as she pulled it out, her phone vibrated with a quick coded text from Clay. "He's on his way, now!" Eleanor froze, the folder heavy in her hands. The message meant Silas Creek was making his move, and Clay, her lover, her spy, had risked everything to warn her. She barely had time to slide the folder under her silk robe and close the safe before she heard the distinct sound of car tires crunching gravel outside. She realized the danger wasn't tomorrow or next week. The true confrontation was happening right now at the Ironwood Ranch. But as Mitch entered the house, she couldn't guess that he was no longer alone, and the man with him was the reason for Clay's desperate warning.
The urgent text from Clay, "He's on his way, now," forced Eleanor to shove the document beneath her robe and slam the safe shut, the heavy click echoing the violent acceleration of her panic. She scrambled out of Mitch's study, gripping the document, the truth about her marriage and the family feud, a cold weight against her skin. Her fear was immediate and crushing, but the instinct to run to Clay, her only ally, was even stronger. She desperately needed the solid reality of his presence against the crumbling artifice of her life. She made it to the upstairs landing just as the front door downstairs creaked open, and Mitch's voice, low and strained, echoed from the foyer. He wasn't alone. A second, deeper voice, sharp, controlled, and radiating authority, answered him. Eleanor froze in the shadows, realizing this was the real danger. Mitch had brought his troubles, and possibly Silas Creek, right into her home. This was her internal hook. The terror of discovery was suddenly physical, driving her into the closest refuge, the dimly lit service hallway leading toward the master suite. But instead of entering her bedroom, she instinctively turned the opposite way, toward the back staircase that led down to the staff quarters, a clear, desperate choice. She wasn't running for safety. She was running for Clay. She found him waiting by the back exit, his face a mask of tense alertness, clearly listening to the muffled voices from the main house. Without a word, Ellie stumbled into his chest, clutching the folder, the hard muscles of his body offering an immediate primal comfort. His arms wrapped around her instantly, pulling her tight into the shadows, their hearts beating a furious, synchronized rhythm against each other. "They're here," she whispered into his shoulder, the raw fear finally cracking her composure. "Mitch brought him here." Clay said nothing, only tightened his embrace, the silence confirming the danger. He wasn't Mitch. He didn't offer empty words or solutions. He offered a powerful, unwavering shield, a shared silence that was more intimate than any conversation. They stood pressed together in the dark, the scent of hay and danger replacing the stale scent of Mitch's cologne, their proximity a deliberate act of defiance. Eleanor felt the document pressing into Clay's side, and the weight of the secret momentarily eclipsed the weight of her wedding ring. She knew the risk of being caught was monumental, but in his arms, hiding in plain sight, she was finally home. The heavy door to the main house upstairs closed, muffling the voices of Mitch and his unwelcome guest. This was the ultimate test of their forbidden bond, hiding mere yards away from the man who owned Ellie's safety and the man who owned Clay's freedom. Pressed together in the cramped, dark hallway, the document about the land still clutched in her hand, the adrenaline and fear quickly morphed into a furious, desperate passion. The danger was intoxicating, a chaotic justification for their reckless desire. Clay's hand, which had been offering comfort, moved to cup Ellie's face, turning her toward him. His eyes, usually guarded, were dark and burning with a reckless intensity that mirrored her own terror. He didn't speak, knowing words were too risky, but the language of his body was loud and clear: survival and defiance. This shared peril made their connection instantly, devastatingly real, stripping away every civilized pretense. The kiss was the antithesis of the cold silence that reigned in the main house. It was a hungry, silent act of rebellion, a desperate promise made without words. Eleanor clung to him, the texture of his rough denim against her silk robe a profound contrast that highlighted the two irreconcilable worlds she was caught between. She tasted the fear and the desperation in the kiss, realizing that this was not just passion, this was their last stand. This moment was the internal hook. In the heat of the embrace, her mind flashed back to a decade of politely accepted loneliness, of sterile air and distant respect. The risk they were taking right now, the sheer aliveness of the moment felt infinitely more valuable than all the quiet security Mitch had ever offered her. She realized she would rather face ruin and scandal in Clay's arms than remain wealthy and numb by Mitch's side. Suddenly, a door creaked open downstairs, and the deeper voice, the unmistakable sharp tone of Silas Creek called out, "Mitch, where is your wife? I need to speak to the lady of the house." The sound pierced the silence, a cold, hard reminder that the world was closing in. Ellie gasped, pulling back, her breathing ragged, the illicit moment violently interrupted by the call of duty. Clay instantly flattened himself and Ellie against the wall, his strong hand muffling her mouth, shielding him with his body as the footsteps approached the bottom of the back staircase. She could feel the furious beat of his heart against her ear, realizing that the man who had the power to destroy her life was standing just below them, demanding her presence. The silence after Silas Creek's demand for the lady of the house was deafening. Ellie could hear her own heart roaring against the fabric of Clay's shirt. His hand, still covering her mouth, was the only thing preventing her from crying out, or perhaps from running to face the inevitable. The raw, desperate desire of the moment before was replaced by a cold dread. They were pressed against the shadows, their illegal connection about to be exposed by the man below. Mitch's voice, tight with panic, finally answered. "She's retired for the night, Silas. This is a business matter. She doesn't need to be involved." The attempt to shield her felt too little, too late, and almost seemed to anger the man downstairs. Ellie could hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Silas Creek moving from the foyer toward Mitch's office, the sound signifying a predator moving in for the kill. This was her internal hook, the moment she realized she was not just protecting herself, but also protecting Clay. Her alliance with him, forged in stolen passion, now felt like a desperate shield against a common enemy. She tightened her grip on the hidden document, knowing the truth in her hand was the only leverage she possessed against this entire terrifying conspiracy. Suddenly, Silas's voice boomed from the doorway of Mitch's study, cutting through the silence. "The Ironwood Ranch isn't just collateral, Mitchell. This land belonged to the Walker family for 3 generations, and your wife's family, the Vances, took it 50 years ago. I'm here to collect a family debt, and the only man with the rights to reclaim this land is the only remaining Walker heir." Ellie's blood ran cold. She slowly turned her head to look up at Clay, who stood rigid beside her, his dark eyes fixed on some distant, invisible horizon. Silas's next words delivered the final, devastating blow. "Mitch, call Nathaniel in here. It's time he stopped playing ranch hand and started acting like the owner." Nathaniel. The name sliced through the darkness like a knife, freezing Eleanor's soul. Her forbidden lover, the man she ran to for solace, the simple, honest ranch hand named Clay, was not who he seemed. She realized the whole affair, the passion, the trust, the shared secrets, it had all been a lie, part of an elaborate, cold-blooded plan to steal her inheritance. The story of Eleanor and Nathaniel at the Ironwood Ranch proves that when love is forbidden, it comes at the highest price, and it can be the biggest betrayal of all. If this story resonated with you, if you felt your own pain or struggle in Eleanor's eyes, leave your heart out in the comments below. We want to read your story and welcome you into our community. And if this journey of romance, risk, and revenge hooked you, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to follow more intense narratives like Eleanor's. Your support helps us bring you more forbidden stories like this one.